So let's take a look at stories making the headlines in the media today. We start with news from the Daily Telegraph's business pages. According to the Bank of England Governor, Mark Carney, the UK is heading for a smooth Brexit. Mr Carney made his comments as British stocks reportedly enjoyed their best day in 3 years. The Independent, though, looks at what we've just mentioned, the Prime Minister looking at publishing legislation this week that would stop him from extending Brexit negotiations with the EU beyond the end of next year. The paper quotes opposition politicians saying the move risks sending the UK straight off the no-deal cliff. The New York Times questions the cost of adventure, asking how the eruption of the volcano on White Island will affect tourism in New Zealand going forward. The industry represents nearly 6% of the country's economic output and employs more than 14% of the workforce. The Financial Times has the story of the class action against tech giants Apple, Google, Microsoft, Dell and Tesla being brought on behalf of families of children killed or injured while mining cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The metal is critical for smartphones and electric vehicles. The FT is saying human rights groups claim the companies are aiding and abetting supply chains that force children to work in dangerous conditions. And the Times reports that petrol and diesel cars will be completely barred from one road in the city of London. Drivers of pure combustion engine cars will face fines of £130, that's around $170, if they enter Beech Street, where levels of toxic air regularly exceed the legal limit. Well, Oliver Cornock is back from Oxford Business Group. Oliver, let's get stuck in. The viewers have been in touch in earnest about that last story I've mentioned, so we'll try and get to some of their responses. But if we start with the Telegraph, the business section, looking at Mark Carney's take on the so-called Boris bounce on financial markets.
Absolutely, and we've seen trading up by 2.5% on the UK's flagship indices. All the figures here in the Telegraph. Admittedly, this would be a newspaper, we have to say, that would be broadly sympathetic to Boris Johnson and the Conservative government. I think that's important. However, there's another angle here. I think this story probably broke before the news that the no deal was back on the table, this negotiating stance, which we're going to come to in a minute. Now, I think this honeymoon period might be quite short-lived because the Office of Budget Responsibility, the body within the UK civil service that sort of keeps the government in check on its budget, has said that the Chancellor Sajid Javid's figures are going to be really tight now. The election, of course, has given Boris Johnson on one hand a much bigger mandate, but he also has to keep all of those people that have, as he in his words, lent him his vote enfranchised, and that's going to involve significant spending. The great attack on the Conservative Party was austerity had gone on for too long. That needs to be turned around if you're a Tory, and therefore there's a lot of pressure. So I think the mood music is changing really quite quickly. So I think this is potentially slightly a misleading headline.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark Carney possibly making those comments way before the news came through, which is in our next story, The Independent. They describe it as, well, they're quoting, reckless PM puts no-deal Brexit back on the table. And as you say, this could be a reason why we see a bit of a drop-off maybe in trading in London today when traders return to their desks. Absolutely,
and we saw overnight, didn't we, that 0.5% reduction in the pound's value in overnight trading. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. Interesting to see what happens on the FTSE as well. But to this story, reckless. Now, the Independent have been broadly pro-Remain. That's a quote also from the Liberal Democrat interim leader, Sir Ed Davey. So important to position this in its political context. As we said when we discussed this on the hour, Sally, this is really very much a political move. It's designed to speak to the people who voted for Boris Johnson with that big 80-plus majority now, and very much to get Brexit not only back on the table, but Brexit done. And I think this is him trying to speak to them, trying to meet that promise made on so many doorsteps. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out in Parliament over the next couple of days, actually.
There is a lot to do, though, isn't there? As you say, I mean, the timetable is pretty tight. You mentioned Sajid Javid, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. I mean, he hasn't delivered a budget yet. That was supposed to happen in November. That was delayed because, of course, a general election was happening. So he'll have his budget, no doubt. There's a lot to do. There's 100 new Conservative MPs to become a part of Parliament. The process is, the time frame is very, very tight, and yet there's a lot to do between now and the end of 2020. And this is the issue, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that sort of momentum to keep driving this through is something that Boris Johnson has been very keen to campaign on.
And I do wonder how Brussels reacts to this news as well. From their perspective, of course, they want to, start fresh negotiations off the back of this new government being appointed, etc. But how does this go down there?
It was interesting, wasn't it? Because there was talk last week of, if this scenario happened, that Brussels itself might put forward an extension, try and soften things. That hasn't happened. It seems to me that they're sort of keeping their powder dry at the moment.
And it's a new guard in Brussels too.
And I was just going to say, absolutely, a completely new set of negotiators there as well.
Interesting times. Now let's move on to the front page of the New York Times, which has got a feature on the price of adventure, looking and focusing on particular on the volcanic eruption that took place on White Island last week. Of course, tragically, all those there on the island, well, many rescued, but they're still fighting for their lives in hospital.
Yes, and eight who were injured died subsequently, taking that toll to 16. I think this is a really interesting one. We at Oxford Business Group talk about tourism as part of the economy in lots of markets around the world. And one of the great sort of trends recently has been the experiential tourism. New Zealand has really set its store by adventure tourism. The advertising is all about whitewater rafting, helicoptering over places, diving with dolphins in places. Nature really being at the fore. It's also set itself out as being very much minimising the nanny state. I think Kiwis are quite keen to keep that, and indeed this story speaks to that. However, the power of nature has really been seen, hasn't it, on White Island? And I suppose this article is speaking about not only the price of that in terms of human cost, but also if you're the New Zealand government, it's a significant part of your GDP. It employs an awful lot of people, so there needs to be a balance met. And of course, the other thing here, the island was privately owned. Is there any comeback on that? It's a very tricky
It's a really
story.
difficult one, and it also sort of speaks to those who love those adventure holidays, that actually you've got to make your own decisions on whether something is safe or a good idea or not. You can't just go with local advice necessarily on whether something's okay to go and visit. I mean, that's what I thought.
Absolutely,
when this happened on White Island last week.
I think that's the whole thing of this experiential travel, these exciting things. People want to do that because I think we all have a yearning to get out of our comfort zone.
Indeed. Right. Companies and market section of the Financial Times. Tech giants sued over cobalt deaths. I read this morning and I was horrified by this read, actually. Well, it was news to me.
We've just been talking about getting out of your comfort zone. This is a read that gets you out of your comfort zone. This is the near Dickensian standards of children working in these rare earth mines. In this case, cobalt, 60% of the world's cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the economy, incidentally, is not in a great shape either, just has some IMF help. This is a class action. This is a group of an NGO, essentially, bringing forward an action on behalf of the families of children that have died against these big tech giants. Another tech giant story, Sally. But we all have these gadgets. We all have them.
Yeah, and this is the thing. We all have these gadgets. Many people are driving Tesla cars around the world, and yet we're unaware of this story. And yet you assume that Apple and Tesla and others and Dell will check their supply chain. And you assume that takes place in this day and age, don't you?
And so many of these products, these rare earths, are coming from China, where there is questionable standards. And this is about upholding and implementing policies that these companies have said they do. And that's quite an interesting one.
We'll see how that class action lawsuit progresses. Now on to The Times. Zero Emission Street will introduce total ban on petrol and diesel cars. This is a story we've been discussing throughout the hour. Beech Street, it's an enclosed tunnel, isn't it, that goes under the Barbican estate. For those who aren't aware, it can get pretty toxic in there. It's
the Barbican, for those who don't know, is this wonderful brutalist structure in London City, in the square mile, built sort of post-war, very big, very heavy, and there's a tunnel underneath it. Well, in the middle of summer, it's pretty grim going through there, especially if you're cycling or walking. So I personally think this is great, and the point of this story, I suppose, is A, will it be a success, and B, perhaps more importantly, is this the beginning of further closures? We've seen in cities around the world alternate number plate days.
They're experimenting with all sorts of ideas, aren't they, to try and tackle this problem of emissions, especially in the heat of the summer in certain cities around the world.
And the health figures here, they're astonishing. An estimated 40,000 premature deaths coming from air pollution, so something that we really must all be thinking about.
Thank you very much, Ollie. It's been great to have you on the programme.